We're live. Good
All right.
morning.
Good morning, everybody. I usually do the intro. Do you want to take it over, Cristina?
Sure. I'm Cristina, and this is Sara over on my other side, and we are the co-head honchos of One Woman Shop, a resource hub and community for women solo business owners. And we are here today to talk about essentialism. So we're here every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern to do the hot seat, where we just kind of blab about different topics. Little shout out to Blab there. And today we're talking about Essentialism, which is an interesting book that we've just wrapped up reading. And more or less, we'll talk about that. So we will be just chatting about all things Essentialism. I just said that like 4 times.
Yeah, no, it's essential. So
essential.
We're actually bringing our One Woman Shop book club onto Blab for the first time ever. So this was our book actually for December that we've carried into January. And in honor of bringing book club to Blab, I'm drinking out of my mug that has a bunch of famous first lines of novels on it. Cheers.
That's awesome.
Also a huge nerd. Anyway,
love it. Also, I wanted to tell you, I have my own standing desk. I got jealous of your standing desk. So today I have my sister's kitchen island, and on top, my computer's propped on top of that, on top of a box of wine glasses.
Oh, very appropriate. All right.
That is my standing desk today.
I like it. All right. Should we jump right in?
Let's do it. So, thoughts on essentialism? Go.
Well, interesting caveat is that I didn't finish the book, and I know you find that interesting. Do you want to tell people why?
I do. I find this I don't think anyone's ever been applauded for not finishing a book for book club. But I feel like for Sara, I said this is like a big coup for you, because I know, because we've talked about it, that you have a problem needing to finish books. Like you can't put them down after you started reading them. And so especially I would say probably a book club book or a business book. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so the fact that you didn't finish, I think is very essentialist, which is very meta, because you were focused on other things like our Solopreneur Sanity launch that's coming up and client work. Is that right?
Yeah. No, that's exactly it. I will finish the book. I've actually really enjoyed it so far. And it's not that I don't want to finish it. It just came down to having to choose and prioritize. And it was really, really difficult because a month ago, I probably would have pulled an all-nighter last night just to finish the book. But I did realize that I probably wouldn't be standing up right now if I did that. So I went to bed, and I did read a little bit more this morning, but only after I had finished the priorities that I had set out for the morning. So definitely not easy to show up knowing I didn't read the last 35% of the book. But yes, I guess an interesting example.
I threatened Sara that I would just bring up random things and be like, so Sara, what's your opinion on this? Oh, you didn't get there? Just kidding. No, I honestly think it's really great. And I think that we are, because we're right in the midst of the launch of Solopreneur Sanity, we're like, launching is crazy, but we can't be fully absorbed in the craziness. And this is the perfect time to practice what we preach. And we've been having that reiterated to us, I think, over the last 2 months, if not more. But this is a perfect example. So I'm proud of you.
Yeah. So thank you. I appreciate that. And I wanted to start with that so that when you did call me out, everybody kind of knew. But how about we start we do have a few questions to answer, but yeah. Cristina, I want to get your overall impression of this book. So to give a little background for book club for One Woman Shop, we have read Thrive, we've read Big Magic, and we've read Girl Boss. So this is our 4th book. So I'm curious about how you feel this lines up.
So overall, I would say my impression of essentialism is that I really, really like the concept. I like the examples that he uses, and I always enjoy when somebody basically doesn't try to recreate the wheel, that they pull from other people. And so he has quotes scattered throughout. That's something I think both of us really liked about Thrive. And so I liked all those things. This isn't the kind of book that I would I wouldn't talk about it to everyone and be super excited about it. And I didn't love reading it. I really enjoyed reading it, but it wasn't the same level of that I felt with Thrive, where I was like, this is the best book ever. How about you?
Yeah, I think based on the fact that I really did read Big Magic, for example, in a day, it's clear to me that this wasn't like that super engaging, I'm going to rope you in and you have to finish type of thing. But I think the difference actually was that so many of these things in Essentialism really hit home for me that I read it slower. And I didn't necessarily want to read it before bed because it really started turning things in my head. Not that Big Magic and Thrive didn't, because they absolutely did. But this was like a different, really introspection of things need to change. And I really want to take this stuff to heart and see how it can actually affect my day to day. So, and then when what happened is, during the day when I wanted to be reading it, I was like, this probably isn't the best time. So I definitely put it on a different level than Thrive or Big Magic. And I think it's because those things spoke to me in a different way. But like you said, it was still a really good read. Just not necessarily one we want to shout from the still do with Thrive and Big Magic.
Oh, I think yep, you're back.
Okay,
cool. There's a big pause. No, yeah, I completely agree. And I think that I like how we just kind of casually skip over Girl Boss. Just don't really talk about that one. So I'm curious. First of all, I'm wondering, I was thinking about this. I was like, how do you really sum up Essentialism? I'm curious if you have an effective way to sum it up in a sentence or two. And if not, we can default to the tagline.
Well, yeah, honestly, like that is kind of where I'd go with it. So the tagline, if I'm saying it correctly, is the relentless pursuit of less but better. Something like that.
There's something about the disciplined pursuit of less.
The discipline, yeah. Okay, so that whole idea of less but better was really the overarching theme, and then it kind of takes you through how to evaluate what you have going on, how to eliminate what you have going on. So it takes you kind of through different phases of actually pursuing less, even if you already have a ton on your plate.
Which is a question that we've gotten that we will definitely talk about because we definitely both have ideas around that. But yeah, I think that a big thing that came up for me was just this idea of, which has come up in Brene Brown's books as well, Rising Strong. But if you are not in control of your time and your life and your priorities, then other people are going to step in and take control. So if you kind of feel like a rag doll getting tossed around, he's basically saying that's kind of your problem. Like you need to step up and take care of it. I just said it much more harshly than he does, but basically.
No, that's exactly it. In fact, I think one of the things I wrote down was, if you don't set your own boundaries, somebody else will for you. And that's so true. When you don't set your boundaries, it doesn't matter if it's a client, if it's a business partner, if it's your mom, it really doesn't matter. If you don't set those boundaries, somebody else will. And I think the example he gives is, and he gives so many examples, which I love, but it's also very hard to remember them because he gives so many.
We're going to mix up our metaphors.
Yeah. So it was a school on a busy street, and they had a playground outside, but the kids they had to stay within about 10 feet of the building so that the teachers could see them until they put up the fence, and then they could actually use the whole yard. And it's that whole idea of if you put the boundaries in place, you actually give yourself more freedom because you're not trying to stay constrained to what other people are putting in place for you. I thought that was a really interesting example, I guess.
Okay, you summed that up. That was awesome. Yeah, there was definitely a few catchphrases that caught my eye throughout. And so one that he says a lot, and we've seen in other contexts, specifically I'm thinking of our chat with the girls from the Event Chic. And they said, and he says, live life by design, not by default. And so I kept coming back to that. It's like, yeah, like the life I want to lead is the life that I have designed, not the one that's just fallen into my lap or one that I feel trapped in or feel like I can't get out of. So that's me a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought, we talk a lot about day design, especially in the pursuit of solopreneur sanity. So that's it. Actually, so much of this book relates to stuff that we approach in solopreneur sanity. So a lot of the disciplines that he's actually introducing are things that can help us in the scenarios we face as solopreneurs. So we actually have an entire solution in Solopreneur Sanity about building buffers, which is hilarious because I didn't read that section until today, and we wrote that 2.5 months ago.
That stuck out at me so much. There was probably like 20 times when I was reading that and when I started Rising Strong that I was like, this is everything we've written about, like in mostly the same ways, but I think we obviously put a different spin on it. We put different examples around it, but it's like, this is a summary of all these things that people we think are really wise are saying. So hopefully we're following in their footsteps in a good way.
Yeah, and I think it brings up the fact that we all face these issues. We are writing from the perspective of solopreneurs facing these issues, but the fact that Brene Brown is writing about it and Greg McKeown, I'm not sure if that's how you say it, but the fact that they're also writing about these shows that these scenarios, these issues, they pop up in so many different cultures and so many different places. So it is definitely interesting.
Yeah. So I think it would be cool to talk about how we've used Essentialism so far and how we kind of plan to. And I would be curious to hear how you might find it useful in your business or in your life. But I know that it's come up for us. We made some notes on the audit document as we were going through our audit of the business last year, the end of 2015, and wrote a piece from Essentialism, which is finding the intersection of the things you're inspired by, the things you're talented at, and the things that meet a need. And he also encourages people to look at what you're not just what you are. And so I think we found that really valuable is, what services and offerings do we not want to provide because it's not our expertise. So.
Yeah, no, I really like that. That actually gets into one of the questions that we did have that we'll answer very soon. But it was, for me, I think the thing that I've already been able to do is set boundaries that I was uncomfortable putting in place before. Because the minute I realized that huge issue of not, if I don't do it, somebody else will, it became so apparent to me where so much of my stress comes from. And so that's something that I started doing actually around the holidays. So I try to start my days around between 5 and 5:30 every day. But then I'm not shutting down until about 10 at night some days, and that you can't burn the candle at both ends. So what I had actually gotten myself into was having clients know that I worked both that early in the morning and that late at night. And so they expected me to be on at both of those times. I got myself into a real trap with that because suddenly the reason I get up early is because I do my best writing very early in the morning when it's still dark out, when nobody's around, when I'm not getting emails. I lost that time because all of a sudden it was, well, she's up early. She can have this to us by 7:30 tomorrow morning. And so I was getting up to finish the client work because they'd be expecting it the minute they walked into the office. Right. And I lost the time that I had to do my own thing. And suddenly I'm like, why am I getting up so early? I'm not using it for how I wanted to use it. So that's actually something that I've been able to change right away. In fact, I've really capitalized on it this week when I have a bunch of client work that I actually am using that morning time for because I need my best writing, but they don't know that and they don't expect it. And that just changes the game entirely.
So have you just communicated this to yourself and said, I know that I'm not responding to emails until say 9 a.m. or have you actively communicated it with your clients?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question because there's been one client that I did have to communicate it with, but otherwise it was literally just me making the change of boomeranging emails to send a few hours later or the next day if I was doing it at night, or just holding off on responding and not making the promise of having the work to them and actually building in that buffer without having read Essentialism yet. So it's kind of a combination, but it is very obvious that just by your actions, you don't actually have to explicitly say something all the time. Just by your actions, you set those boundaries.
Yeah. Well, it always makes me think of Sarah Von Bargen, who I'm actually going to mention later on because I have to use her in another example, but she is the blogger at Yes and Yes. And so she also has a small business blog, and she always talks about how she's super strict and she doesn't respond, I guess, before 9 or after 6 p.m., I think, or on the weekends. And so she's really set that expectation with her clients. And so they know that those are the office hours. And so that's just always stuck in my head. It's like, yeah, if you want people to respect your time, this is something we also say in Solopreneur Sanity. You can't expect people not to email you in the middle of the night. If they want to send you an email at midnight, you can't get mad about it. But what you can do is decide when you're going to respond back, and communicate. And so, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. No, and it's recognizing what we do have control over and actually exercising the choice in that instance. Right. Yeah, I love that. So I'm wondering if we want to jump into a question we were asked, because I feel like that'll lead into a few different
Definitely.
things. And actually, Danielle is on the call and she asked the question. So Danielle, if you want to hop in and actually ask live, feel free. But otherwise, we'll just kind of sum it up for you. So I'll give you a second there. But it's about the issue of when you already have a ton of stuff on your plate, how do you necessarily go about eliminating especially when there are other people involved, and it's not just yourself, even though it's very difficult just to let go of some stuff for ourselves too. All right, let's jump in.
Yeah,
what do you say?
Let's do it.
No problem, Danielle.
So we'll just say the exact wording that Danielle said is, how do you go through the process of eliminating some things you've said yes to in the past before you discovered the benefits of essentialism? And basically that feeling of responsibility to hold on to things, including old services. So I think Sara and I decided to approach this from, basically both having an opinion. And I read Sarah's notes and I was like, oh, that's a totally different approach than I wrote, but it's not contradictory. So if you want to go first, I feel like yours is a good lead in.
Awesome. Okay. So one of the concepts I pulled out of Essentialism that speaks directly to this, and I'm sure there are several more, is when he introduced the idea of using zero-based accounting for how you actually take stuff on. And as somebody that loathes accounting, I thought this was like, hey, we can usefully use, really clever there, an accounting concept here. So with zero-based accounting, it's essentially not taking last year's budget and using that as your baseline this year. Instead, you wipe your slate clean. You start at zero, and you have to make a deliberate choice about everything that you add into that budget. Well, the same can go for, I'm using the example of services as a solopreneur. The same goes for your services, wiping the slate clean of everything that you offer, going back to that drawing board, and then making that deliberate choice about what you want to add back in. But the important thing there is it's super easy to say, well, I love doing X, Y, Z, so I'm going to put that back in. I love doing this, or I have clients for that. It's actually coming up with that predetermined criteria for what you're going to add back in. And he does get into this, and I didn't take really great notes on it. But I think he had like 3 levels of criteria where if it had to meet 1, it had to meet 2, and it had to meet 2 out of 3 of the third. It was some like minimum to extreme criteria. For me, it's going back to the idea of, especially for services, the things that you like to do, the things you see the demand for, and the things you have the time for. Those are 3 of the criteria I would use. That doesn't necessarily mean they're the criteria that you would use. But then having an honest conversation once you've decided the things that make that cut, having that honest conversation with yourself and with the people that it affects about why you are eliminating what you're eliminating. And I actually just had to do this. I had a call with a client last week. At the end of December, I decided I was no longer going to offer a specific service. I had already promised them that I would do this for January, so I'm just wrapping it up now, but I wanted to have this call back in December. Or I wanted to tell them at least. So we had the call last week, and it was a simple explanation of, I had to evaluate everything I'm doing, and this doesn't fit in because I want to make more space for X, Y, Z, and they completely appreciated that decision. Now, I did point them to other people that could fill that gap, so there's kind of that contingency, but you don't have to do that. And she would have been totally okay if I didn't do that. So that's how I actually used that in context. So I hope that's helpful, but I'm super excited to see how you came at this, Cristina.
You just stole my whole answer. No. No, it's just funny because you looked at it from like, as you're deciding what services, like how do you decide the thought process, what to keep and what to eliminate? And I just looked at the question as, how do you communicate that? Which you got into at the end of your answer there. And so my two things were, I'll just sum it up super briefly because same thing, but basically give them enough time and give them an alternative person or resource when possible. And then I said, basically my general philosophy is if you've handled it the best you can by doing those things, and the person's upset, it's kind of out of your hands. Like if someone's irrationally upset, even though you've done your best, like there's not much you can do about that. And honestly, you probably don't want to be working with that person. But I know that's super oversimplified. But I also found it, so going back to Sarah Von Bargen again, shout out. So I thought it was interesting because she just sent out an email to her list and she's like, I am phasing out this service. You can get it. You can still get it until whatever deadline. But after that, I won't be offering it. And so I thought it was a really cool chance for people to get it one last time if they really wanted it, but maybe had been stalling. I'm sure it's good from her side on the business side because it brings in income of people who maybe have just not taken action, but now that there's a deadline that they will. And so and then I liked how she kind of explained why she was phasing out the service, which is in her case, ghostwriting. And so I think it just kind of it was very transparent and it gave people one last opportunity. And so I thought that was a good way to handle it. So, yeah. And go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think we're getting a little into like our business coaching principles here, but that's really okay. Because the one thing you kind of alluded to is you have to be okay with whatever response they give you. And that is up to them. That's not up to you. Yeah. And recognizing that it is business as much as it affects us personally when we're solopreneurs. But this client I do other work for them. They easily could have said to me, well, never mind, we're not going to send any of your work your way. And I had to be prepared for that to come back. But to me, it was that trade-off of, well, I really don't want to be doing X, Y, Z. So if I lose everything, it's worth it.
Well, so I think that's a really good lead in to a big thing. We mentioned solopreneur sanity, just can't stop mentioning it. It's definitely front of mind, but Derek Shivers, the whole, if it's not a hell yes, it's a no. So we had this experience. We said no to a potential member and we got back a pretty nasty email. Like I think we were both pretty surprised by kind of the venom in the email. And I know that, obviously that triggers a bunch of feelings and we feel guilty and we feel bad. But ultimately it's like we made that decision. And so, yeah, you have to know that potentially you could be burning that bridge. And even if you feel like you've handled it the best, you again can't take in, you don't know how people are going to react and you just kind of have to make peace with it. And
yeah, no, that's a great example, especially because what helped us make that decision, even though it was the harder decision, was that we have an application process for One Woman Shop membership in place for a reason. And it's because there are certain criteria, and it's not necessarily something that somebody has to measure up to, but it's the measures that we put in place to make sure we can maintain the integrity of the group. If we didn't have that criteria in place, I don't think either of us would have felt nearly as sure about that decision. Yeah. But even though we got that response and we were both surprised, we still knew because of that criteria that it was the right thing to do. And it just became, it became sad that somebody did respond to that like that. But it's exactly like you said, it kind of confirmed our decision.
So. Yeah, absolutely. And I think another big thing that comes up in Essentialism, going back to the book, is this idea of trade-offs. And so I just love this concept. It's one of those concepts that's obvious, but we don't necessarily think about on a day-to-day basis. And so did that stand out to you at all?
Yeah, for sure. Especially for me, knowing how to kind of evaluate the opportunities in comparison to each other. But I'd like to hear what you thought about how you see it actually factoring in.
Yeah, I guess going back to the question from Danielle, it's, you can keep this service around and you can keep your old commitments, and we definitely love people who follow through on their commitments. But if something's just kind of lingering and it's, you dread it every single day, if you just think and ask yourself the question, what could I be doing instead? It's a really big eye opener, I think, and gets the wheels turning that you can't do everything. The whole phrase, can women do it all? I think it's not just women, but business owners. And so basically he's saying, no, you can't do it all. And it's not, you can do what you want to do, but you also have to make trade-offs. So.
Yeah, it's a really powerful question to ask yourself what you have to give up in order to make it happen. Because I think a lot of us are the type that will say we can just squeeze it in, when in reality, you always have to give something up. So that for me, that's the really strong question of, all right, well, if I have to give something up, is it worth it? And if it's not, then this probably isn't my best opportunity. Yeah. So I thought that was awesome. And it also goes, he brings up this, he kind of glosses over this, but I feel like it's a really big part of the basis of essentialism, is that priority was actually entered into the dictionary as a singular noun. It was, priorities wasn't a word. And I thought that was really interesting, because it is funny to me how often we have 10 priorities. And how do you prioritize your priorities? It loses all sense of the meaning of the word priority. So that's another place where those trade-offs really come in of, well, I can't make everything a priority, so I have to eliminate something.
And I think that he does a really good job, for the most part, about scattering in really helpful questions and prompts. And, we love to prompt ourselves with questions. We like to prompt our coaching clients with questions. So there was definitely some in the book that stuck out at me. And so one thing he said, if you're working with a boss, but you can also do it with yourself or with your business partner, is if an opportunity comes up, you say, great, super excited to do that. What should I deprioritize? And basically it's this trigger to your boss. It's a trigger to yourself that you have to deprioritize. And it's coming back to this idea of trade-offs, that no, you can't do it all and you can't have more than one priority. So I found that stuck out at me.
How I wish I would have had that question when I did work in a corporate job of, hey, you're adding this on? Great. What do you want me to take off? That would have been just amazing, I think, and probably would have got me fired. But I love that question. Yeah. So one thing that we both pulled out was the idea of, if you didn't already own something, what would you spend to buy it? Right. When it comes back to taking more on to your plate. So I want to kind of hear why you pulled that out.
Yeah, so I think it actually relates again back to the question of, I want to maybe get rid of some of the commitments I already have. And so it's asking yourself, if I didn't have this ebook, would I fight in order to be able to write this ebook? And a lot of times I think the answer is no. Like right now it's just kind of a nightmare and I just dread it. But yeah, what about you?
Well, I thought he uses the metaphor of a closet a lot, which is funny because at least once a year I do a massive closet clean out. And even though I feel really good about it, I still fall into so many of the traps that he says. So I can relate to this on so many levels. But I did think it was really interesting. He shares a study, and I forget what the object was. Coffee mug. Yeah. Appropriate. And he gives, and it wasn't his study, it was a study that was done somewhere. And I hope I say this right, but half of the people are given a mug and they have to sell it to the people that don't have the mug. But before they name their price that they want for it, the people that don't have the mug have to say what they'd be willing to pay for it. So it's the two opposite ends of the spectrum. You don't own it, what would you pay for it? And you do own it, what would you give it up for? Now, I actually found that study to be a little questionable because, so the outcome, of course, was that the people that didn't own the mug would pay up to like $2.75, whereas the people that were selling wouldn't sell it for less than over $5, right. Something like that. In my mind, I'm like, well, of course they want to sell for a profit, so there's a little bit of bias.
But they didn't actually pay anything in the beginning, so anything that they sell it for would get a profit.
Yeah, I still looked at it as people are gonna sell for a higher price, but you're right. They weren't it's not like they paid for it in the first place. But I think that's a really great way to also evaluate opportunities. And he gets into that later of, if I didn't already have this opportunity, what would I do to get it? And like you said with the ebook, if I wasn't already writing this ebook, what would I fight to do? What would I fight to get to be able to do it? So that's another way, once you've kind of cleared your plate, of figuring out what you really want to make room for.
Mm-hmm. So another thing, another accounting economics thing that came up with is the idea of sunk cost, which I love and I use all the time. And so I thought of something that we worked on for One Woman Shop that's already out there, but I was like, man, I kept thinking, even as we were working on that, it's like sunk cost, sunk cost. So he was saying that people who have ownership over things have a harder time, obviously, letting them go because you feel ownership. But how a lot of times we'll push through on a project, even though we probably should let it go. And so
I know what you're talking about now.
And so, yeah, so one of his pieces of advice is to ask a neutral second opinion. And so we love accountability. And I definitely find in my life when I turn to people outside of me, I feel like I'm like relatively wise, but then I ask someone and a lot of times their answer gives you're like, I already knew that. I obviously knew it. I just needed to hear it from somebody else. Yeah, idea of accountability.
Yeah, it's definitely that feeling of ownership, and also the fact that, the sunk cost bias is actually based on investment. So not just time, but money. People that put a lot of money into something will keep pushing to make it work, instead of just accepting that they've spent the money. So I really like that idea too. The other thing that I wanted to pull out was the idea of essential intent. And basically for him, he's giving this idea that, and I'm going to quote him exactly here, only with extreme clarity can people, teams, and organizations fully mobilize and achieve something excellent. So only when they have a really defined goal that's communicated well, can a team or a person mobilize to actually work towards that goal. So what he's kind of using it as, people that operate without an essential intent are making decisions every day on this really small basis, but the decisions are 10 times harder because they don't have that driving force. Whereas if you set your essential intent, you're essentially creating like a lighthouse for all your decisions. So I think he says it's like the one decision that actually makes 1,000 decisions. Mm-hmm. This I pulled out because I was like, this is the first year that I've chosen a word of the year. And this is exactly why I chose a word as opposed to setting a resolution. Mm-hmm. Well, I didn't set a resolution because they never pan out. But with the word, it really felt like that essential intent where everything that we do or I do throughout the year can be measured against that word. And it's certainly not the same as him talking about essential intent, because he's really talking about measurable goals that people put in place. Whereas I'm using this as more of like this loose guidance. Yeah. So, but I still thought it gives a lot more weight to choosing a word, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Still working on my word. Yeah. So, and there's a few other things that stuck out. So maybe we just kind of do a quick little run through the other things that jumped out at us, and then yeah, there was. I got a little snarky. I like write, my little comments, and there was just sometimes where I was like, they were like, so-and-so said no, and everyone accepted it, and everyone was happy. And I was like, of course they were. Like, I literally wrote like, oh, really? Of course they were. And I just felt like sometimes like he just oversimplified. A lot of times, as soon as I thought that, he would give like a little caveat that would acknowledge that he was oversimplifying. But that was definitely something where I was like, how convenient. All your examples perfectly line up. But so one thing that stood out to me was this idea of the paradox of success. So I thought of you because I was thinking about how you're really good at copywriting. And so you get a ton of client leads that you then have to either take on or turn down. But it's because, so basically he says that people work really well, and as soon as they're successful, other people see their success and decide like, I want them involved in my project, I want them to take on my copywriting, I want to interview them on my podcast. And so all of a sudden you're inundated with these opportunities and you lose focus. So you basically have to reel yourself in and regain that focus that made you so successful in the first place. So
yeah, no, that is really interesting. Thank you for using me as an example, because that's a compliment. But yeah, I think it was that whole idea of you can't remember, or you aren't practicing the things that made you successful. Is that right? In the first place? Yeah, that is really interesting because, and I do see that because the more I do take on, I actually don't write as well. I don't write as well when I'm overwhelmed. I write well when I'm working on one thing at a time and when I have space to do it. So that is really interesting. And again, I appreciate you using me as an example. Yeah, so I'm going to jump to the idea of the fact that essentialists actually explore more options. Because to me, I was like, wait a minute, I thought this was all about less. But I thought it was really interesting that he's basically saying because essentialists have an intent and criteria, they actually do take the time and make the space to evaluate more opportunities or more choices and take that action of making a really deliberate choice, which I thought was just super interesting in the idea of you have to evaluate more to choose the best and essentially do less.
Essentially. Well, another thing that I think goes along with that about kind of taking time to think and taking time to play, he really emphasizes that he's like a non-essentialist. So he uses essentialist or non-essentialist. He's like a non-essentialist will think that play is stupid and trivial, but an essentialist knows that play is really important. It gets it gets you feeling creative. It gets you out thinking outside the box. And I've talked before on the hot seat about my Waldorf education, which is all about play. And so I don't know, that I really liked that. I was like, yes, play is so important. And I think you and I both have plenty of examples up our sleeves of times where we've taken time away to play, maybe drink, play. And we've had ideas or we've gotten kind of the juices flowing. So
yeah, no, and going right along with that is that I think he talks about how the non-essentialist doesn't protect the asset, which in his case, he's talking about it as your body, your mind. And he kind of channeled a little bit of Arianna Huffington because he talks about sleep and how the non-essentialist doesn't prioritize sleep. And that's another thing, just like play, when you don't take the time to sleep, you see everything in your life kind of diminish. So I thought that was, I highlighted it and, Arianna.
Yes.
We always have to mention her at least once. So
yes. Well, and he indirectly mentioned another one of my favorite books, which is The Power of Now. So he's basically saying how the essentialist recognizes that you truly only have this moment. You can think about the past and you can kind of plan for the future, but ultimately you only are living in this time. So I liked that.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
So,
I know we're totally kind of jumping around here. So if anybody has any questions or wants to hop on, just let us know. I have one or two more things that I can definitely share, as long as we don't mind the hopping. I loved he taught, and this is reading 64% of the book, just for the record. He actually talks about a dinner he was at where Jack Dorsey of Twitter and Square fame did a keynote or a speech of some sort. And he defines his role as CEO, but it's the chief editor of the organization. I thought that was incredibly interesting because he talks about how important editing actually is. He uses an example of a film editor and how that is actually, it's definitely the most under-recognized, but one of the most important things in the film industry, where almost every Academy Award since 1981, where the best picture, the person was also at least nominated for the best editor because it couldn't get to that status without the editor.
Right.
And he slowly transitions into how this applies to your life. But in Jack Dorsey's case, he's the chief editor of his organization because he's at the top level. He sees all of the opportunities, all of the ideas, all of the potential. And it's up to him to maintain the focus. I thought that was really interesting. And I think it's something that we're trying really hard to do as we embarked upon our audit last year and as we choose to do what we're doing this year in 2016 with One Woman Shop. So that was something that really hit home, especially as an editor. I see it in writing all the time where it is 10 times harder to actually say more with less. I've had people that have asked me if I could take a 1,000-word blog post that they wrote and get it down to 250 words to put it in their newspaper because they were trying to take a position on something. Well, to make your point in 250 words is actually a lot harder than 1,000 words. And to them it was just, you just got to trim some stuff.
Right.
So it is. I thought that was really interesting about how hard it actually is to edit out our lives and a lot of stuff.
Definitely. It's just a challenge. This essentialism thing. We're trying to use it, but I mean, I think we'll both acknowledge it's hard. It's hard to know. It's hard to do it once you're clear, but it's also really hard to get clear. Just overwhelming takeaway from the book. It's a tough process, and he acknowledges that.
He does, yeah, and he does say that we shouldn't wait till that point where we aren't clear, we are overwhelmed to make these changes, but this should be normal operating procedures. So, but it definitely takes practice for sure.
So one thing that stuck out at me, and then maybe we can head towards wrap up because we're who knew we'd talk for so long about essentialism. So as I was reading, I was like, I feel like I say no a decent amount in my life and in business, and I've thought of that as being like very stubborn. And as I was reading this, I was like, there's still sometimes where it's just me being stubborn, but then I'm like, there's other times where like, no, I really am protecting like my time and protecting the things that I really want to be focusing on. So I just thought that was an interesting takeaway that like, if anyone out there is feeling like, oh, I'm just a stubborn person, maybe there's some amount of good to that. But obviously it's a spectrum and finding the middle ground. So
yeah, no, I like that a lot. Yeah, so I think if I was going to take one thing and like put it on a Post-it note, because that's what I do, the thing that stepped out at me as like, yes, this is what I need to remember, even though this all is would serve as worthy reminders, was I can do anything, but I cannot do everything. And remembering that. So I guess that's actually what I should have brought up in terms of my overarching theme, or but that's really a reminder that is worth a Post-it note.
My kind of final closing. Oh God, my voice is echoing. My final closing. It was towards the end of the book, and I was just like, "Yep, that's it." Is we can be essentialists that get off track sometimes, or we can be non-essentialists with brief moments of essentialism.
I love that. I didn't get there yet. I love that.
It's basically he asked like, "Are you going to major in essentialism or minor in essentialism?" So I think we're both striving to major, but we'll report back.
And I am excited to actually finish this. And really, it's awesome having a partnership where we both subscribe to a lot of the ideas so that we can serve as reminders for each other.
Sarah, is that essentialist? Are you majoring or are you minoring?
Yeah, and you have to use that tone too.
My hand's on my hip. I can't see it, but it is. Yeah, we share a lot of philosophies. Yeah.
Well, thanks to everybody that's watching, and we'll be back next Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern for our regularly scheduled programming of the Hot Seat. But like we said, a lot of what we're talking about overlaps with Solopreneur Sanity, and we are gearing up for that launch on Tuesday, the 26th, coming up super quick. So we hope you'll be there for it.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.